Hey, welcome back. And joining us today is returning guest, author, truth seeker, and journalist Makia Freeman, whose work you can find on the freedomarticles.com. Makia, how you been?
Good, Christian. Thanks for having me back on.
Crazy times. I'm getting uh, I'm getting pre-COVID vibes from different sources, as I've been alluding to.
There's a very good reason why you're getting those vibes. It's funny how no matter whether it's a fake virus or this war that's going on, it's all the same agenda behind the scenes of what this group, this cabal, is trying to herd us into.
Well, I was just looking at your website today. You're always cranking out great articles. I mean, you have a number of them that we can dive into here on this episode. One of them is called, obviously, the coming 6G deployment. Would love to hear your take on that. What's going on over with Iran? I see, Iran having approved a Straits of Hormuz, like some type of free fee plan, and then obviously we alluded to just earlier COVID style lockdowns. Been seeing people talk a lot about what's going on in Asia, Australia, other parts of the world. Prices just shooting up, especially over in Europe. I'm seeing, and then the Noahide laws, if I'm saying that right. So I'd love to touch on that, and so I guess to, as I usually do, if you could start off situating us where things are at currently and what you feel is most germane.
Sure. Well, I think we spoke about a month ago, and I don't remember if when we were speaking if the Iran war had started yet or not. But certainly there was a massive build up to it, and it wasn't hard to predict that it was going to start. And it's a very sad thing, of course, for the people living in that part of the world, because there's been a lot of civilian deaths on all sides, and then there's all the countries that aren't officially in the war, like all the Gulf Arab states that are getting attacked. War really only benefits the weapons sellers, the people at the top that are making money off it. The average people get sucked into it and caught up in it, and it's a pretty sad thing. So, my take on it is that there's different levels to analyze it from. From the level of like the different sides. It appears okay. Israel and the U.S. were the aggressor. It was unprovoked. They decided to attack. All of the reasons that Trump and the U.S. Whether it was Hegseth, the Secretary of War, or Rubio, the Secretary of State, all the reasons they were giving and the objectives for the war they were giving were a bunch of absolute contradictions that seemed like complete nonsense. None of it made sense. They kept changing the goalposts every day about what the real objectives were. And of course, it's complete nonsense that they were trying to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons, because there's a number of reasons. One is that Trump claimed during last year, 2025, Operation Midnight Hammer, that he completely obliterated Iran's nuclear program. So how can you say that you have to stop them getting a nuclear weapon if your propaganda is true from June last year that you completely obliterated their nuclear weapons program, which they didn't even have? So they're not getting their story straight. And then we have Netanyahu, who's been wanting this war for 40 years. And he's always getting up there in front of the UN, in front of US Congress, or whatever it is, and claiming that Iran is just a couple of weeks away from a nuclear weapon. But when you say that nonstop for 40 years, it kind of starts to lose its veracity. You start to lose a bit of street cred. But somehow, they keep pushing the lies. So on the one level, Iran is a victim, but we have to be careful not to kind of get sucked in, because it is easy to get sucked into cheering for one side, and there's like a segment of the alternative media that's saying, well, BRICS is the alternative to the New World Order, and we have to like cheer for Iran because they're part of BRICS now, and Russia and China, and these guys are going to fight the New World Order. And that's a dangerous narrative to get sucked into. It's not true. The New World Order is not, it's not just about countries. It's a group that's way beyond countries. Countries are just like departments for it, that it controls, that it merges, that it uses different ideologies for, it implants these ideologies into different countries and then plays them off against each other in the divide and rule, divide and conquer fashion. So I've said this in my recent book, The Cult of the Chosen Ones, and in my videos. There's, for a long time now, this satanic cult that rules the world have infiltrated these countries in the East, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's China. So unfortunately, they're not going to be alternatives to some coming technocratic system. I mean, it's nice, and it's a fantasy to think that, but it's not true. And the reason is that Russia, if you look at Russia closely, they're doing a lot of the things that the West is doing in terms of rolling out CBD trials, rolling out 15-minute city trials. They've released statements, joint statements with China, talking about how they are totally behind Agenda 2030, the sustainable agenda, where they want to switch everything over to electric energy and not have any coal or gas or um, any so-called fossil fuels, which by the way is a misnomer. That they're not actually fossil fuels, these things, but people call them that. But they don't want to use any of that kind of energy. They want to have everyone in smart cities, and they're pushing transhumanism. So unfortunately, it's not really going to matter right now. Even though the U.S. and China are opposing the U.S. in a lot of maybe like military and political and economic ways, ultimately they're still part of this overall agenda. And so is Iran. I mean, Iran, on one hand, yes, is definitely pushing back against Israeli hegemony and the Israelis trying to control the Middle East. That is true. But Iran was totally on board with the whole COVID scamdemic. If you go back and look what was happening during 2020, 2021, there were not many countries in the world that were refusing to play along with it. Virtually every country ended up going along with the masking, with the lockdowns, then with the vaccines. Now there were different vaccines available. There were like four or five main ones in the West, and Russia had a Sputnik one, China had one. So some of these countries were refusing to use the Western vaccines, like Iran, but that was really their only way that they differentiated. They still had a vaccine. They just were like, oh, we don't want these like American and British vaccines, and so that was their way of kind of selling it to their population. At no point did they come out and say, this whole thing is a scam. There is no virus, or this virus, if it even exists, is not a problem. We don't need to do these ridiculous things like masking and shutting down our whole economy and locking down. They didn't say that. The really the only countries that wanted to do that were Belarus, and their leader went on record saying that he was offered what was basically a bribe to lock down his entire country. He was going to get all this money, I believe, from the WHO, or maybe it was another organization, but it was one of these globalist organizations. And he said that. Sweden maybe was one of the countries that didn't quite go along with it. There are some countries, really small ones like Nicaragua in Central America, that didn't, and then a couple of African countries. That was about it. All the major countries in the world, and certainly the big players in BRICS, Russia, China, India, Iran, they all went along with it. Remember that the countries in Africa that didn't want to go along with it, their presidents ended up dying under very suspicious circumstances. Right? We had that Magufuli president. I forget exactly which African country he was president of. He was the one that sent in samples of a papaya, and I think it was like something to do with a goat DNA, and it all came out positive for COVID. And he's like, "Here you go." He's like, "This is a scam. We've got a piece of fruit testing positive for COVID. We've got like a sample of goat. It's not even a human sample." And so he was doing great work just in that, pushing back against it, and then he ends up dying mysteriously and getting replaced by a president that did play along with the masking, lockdown, vaccine combination. So that's really important information to remember, to keep in mind when you're looking at all of this, because it does look like, oh, there's these two sides and Iran's fighting for its life, and yeah, on one level there's truth to that, but on another level, how do we know that Iran's not already captured, and that it's not just going to play along with whatever the New World Order really wants? So I always keep that in mind when I'm offering my analysis, because I just know that the people that run the world are so they're so adept at human psychology, and the weaponization of human psychology, the manipulation of it, using different techniques to pull people into drama or conflict, and then get them on a side, and then they can control both sides, and then they can steer people who think they're genuinely opposing something, but they're actually just in like an ideology or a box or a side they're being steered towards a greater end.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because, and as I have been on my journey, just trying to understand things, and I have found some, elements within called alt media or what have your truth community, fill in the blank, to be erroneous, or that there's a lot of questioning about maybe perhaps certain documents or things. But I will still postulate that is a better working model of things and of reality than mainstream narratives concerning that. So I'm seeing, there's flaws in both, but I'll go with alt media as being far more of a better rendition of things. And I'm glad you brought that up as it relates to Iran, because I was going to ask you that. I know I see pundits and people postulate that Iran is a sovereign actor, and they're the victim, and I think that is one perspective or paradigm there, and then the other is that it's this is all part of the kayfabe as it relates to what's going on. And I'll also um, mention that yeah, you mentioned about how people talk about BRICS are against the globalists. Well, yeah, I mean, when you look at Svali, and I had Max Lowen on not too long ago, and a handful of other people, whistleblowers. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing what they share and say. I had Jason Christoph on recently as well, and I don't know what your thoughts are on him, but yeah, yeah, it's a lot more centralized.
Jason Christoph's great. I love his work on mind control. And he did a video that I put a clip of him speaking into a recent video I did, where I was talking about how the Iran war was just so conveniently pushing out the Agenda 2030 goals, because it wasn't that long before this war had started. Maybe we were only a couple of weeks into it when suddenly Iran, US, Israel, it seemed like all players were hitting not just military targets, but they were hitting oil fields, gas fields. I know it's even moved on to desalination plants, but the fact that they're hitting oil and gas fields is a big deal, because then the Gulf Arab states were freaking out. We're like, "Well, you can't do this. Like, what's going on?" Um, and Iran's like, "Well, it's a legitimate military target. We told you if we were going to get attacked, we were going to be. This is the kind of thing we were going to be attacking back." And Israel, of course, just does whatever it wants. If it wants to hit schools or hospitals or UNESCO heritage sites, it does it. It has absolutely no regard for international law at all. Um, but it just seems a little too convenient, doesn't it? Because when all these oil and gas fields are hit, and the world loses 20% of the oil and gas supply, that's a huge deal. And then on top of that, you have the Strait of Hormuz being closed to some vessels and not others. It's another huge deal. And um, it's just a little too convenient, for that to all happen, when that exactly furthers the agenda of this psychopathic ruling class that has no allegiance to any particular country. And this is what they want. They want the rationing. They want the lack of energy supply, so they can ration, so they can use that as control. Um, and so I did some videos talking about how already there were signs, maybe even only 2 weeks into this war, there were signs that some countries were starting to really freak out and make plans for rationing. Pakistan was talking about 4-day work weeks. Other countries are starting to say, okay, we're going to have to limit petrol or gasoline use, especially these countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and Europe as well are dependent upon it. So there's a big chunk of the world that really needs that oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, and that's not the only thing. There's a certain process that's used to take the nitrogen from the oil and gas and then turn that into fertilizer. And so a huge part of the world's fertilizer also comes from the Middle Eastern gas and oil, and then it gets turned into urea, and then that's used as fertilizer for crops around the world. So this is going to impact food supply, crop supply for the whole world. And we're right now in spring, in the planting season. Again, I don't think these things are coincidental. When we're talking about how this is going to lead to, not even potential, but actual energy lockdowns already happening in some parts of the world, and severe disruption of the food supply, less food, that leads into starvation, poverty, and depopulation. Very convenient for the world controllers, because this is the exact thing they've been pushing for years and years and wanting. Going back to all their eugenics plans and population councils and all the different synonyms they had for basically depopulation, where they would call it family planning, population control, all of this stuff. Like the Rockefellers were big into this even before the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And then we had one of these really big guys high up in the satanic network called Henry Kissinger, who absolutely ran US administrations for years, ran a lot of coups, including in Chile. He authored a document, the NSSM 200, National Security Study Memorandum, where he talked about depopulation being the highest priority of the US towards these third world nations. So that you got that in black and white from the 1970s. So they've been pushing this for a long time, and now they have a war where they can really further their goals, their evil goals, because whether Iran's under their direct control or not, Iran has decided as a military objective that it's going to hit these oil and gas fields. Israel's doing it. The U.S., Trump's just a puppet. They can convince the U.S. to do certain things. So now you have, under the guise of what looks like a real legitimate war, and real legitimate military targets, you have this evil agenda coming to the surface of removing, basically as indirectly, the food supply, reducing the food supply, removing oil and gas, and then reducing the world supply.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because why I can't imagine them wanting this to go to waste. I mean, why wrap up this conflict? I mean, even if the conflict is wrapped up, the ripple effect of the oil and gas, fertilizers, helium, many other commodities, et cetera, have already been impacted. So there's already going to be damage done, so to speak. But to your point, they stand to benefit a lot from it. So this is a great pretext. I know I've mentioned on other episodes, and I'm sure you've covered as well. The cashless stuff that I heard going on in Mexico and other pushes in some of these other countries. You also mentioned some of the lockdowns. I know we can, or I think we touched on a little bit of Australia. It's amazing what's going on, and I have a clip that I can actually share here real quick for you in the audience here. I'm gonna bring this up here real quick.
So many people did not believe me when I said we might go into a lockdown due to the situation in Iran, but now I've got proof. Check this out.
Is bringing state and territory leaders together again to finally find an answer to the fuel crisis. Some drastic measures similar to the days of COVID could be on the table as the government braces for a worst-case scenario.
Questions fly about fuel supply.
The anxiety levels are as high as I've seen, maybe with some even higher than COVID.
The further measures they will consider based on the International Energy Agency's plan, encouraging 3 days work from home, 10 kilometres per hour lower speed limits, encouraging public transport and carpooling, and odd and evens number plate days in cities.
We are on the 1 yard line of this whole situation. This is like February of 2020, right before we went into lockdowns in March when the whole COVID disaster happened. You need to be prepared. I would start.
Anyhow, I just thought I'd share that. I don't know if you have any comments on that. I saw that, I thought I'd share that. I thought it was interesting.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, for those that are paying attention and aware, it's the pattern recognition, as that guy said in the clip. They were pushing all this stuff out in February 2020, March 2020 in the West, introducing all these concepts like, rationing and lockdowns and all of this. And it was a foreign concept to a lot of people in the West. Lockdowns for what? And I remember they were saying we have to shelter in place. And I was thinking at the time, shelter from what? Like some little tiny invisible virus. And they're kind of using similar wording now. We need to be on a war footing against this, and it's the same plan. It's the same plan. They're just using the Iran war this time as a pretext. But I want to make a few comments about that, because one aspect of it is the odd and even number plates, or license plates. So how do you think they're going to enforce that? Well, the only way they can do that is by having all this surveillance. So then they just increase the surveillance under the guise of, well, we have to enforce this rule so it's fair for everyone. All we're trying to do is just be fair. And they just use whatever crisis is going on at the moment to increase their plans for control anyway. And then they even want to start limiting people's speeds. I mean, this is the kind of degree of control. I mean, I don't know. Remember, with COVID, none of the rules made sense. They were saying in some countries, you have to be 4 feet apart, you have to be 2 meters apart, you have to be 6 meters apart. And there were all these different contradictory rules, and they were trying to claim, oh, this is what the experts say, but they were just, pulling it out of their, what. There was no science behind any of it, right? Now they're going to say, oh, well, you have to go 10 kilometers more slowly per hour because somehow that's going to save the planet. I mean, it's just whatever control they can get away with, they think they can get away with, they will do. And it's going to be up to people to push back against this and expose it. If people just accept it with docility, as happened with a lot of the population during COVID, then they will enforce this, and they will try to make it as permanent as possible. Once they get their foot in the door, then they can say, well, the world's so much better, society runs better when there's like this, so we're just going to make them permanent. We think that's better. And then we start to really see this whole absolute dystopia, this evil nightmare of 15-minute cities, of having to ask permission to travel outside of your area, of being stuck in an area, of being all electric and having to basically rely on that grid. Like, that's going to start to come into play. And people, we've been warning about this for a while. People that in the alternative media, and people aware of this. And we've been saying it's called Agenda 2030 for a reason. 2030 is the year they selected where they want all of this implemented. There may be some numerological reasons for why they chose that year, but for whatever reason, that's the year they're focusing on. It's 2026. It's only 4 years away. So there's no more time to be sitting back and thinking this is just a theory. This is coming true, and it's going to keep coming true unless we push back against this evil vision.
Yeah, they're moving the Overton window, right? They're acclimatizing us to this agenda that they want, right? Just slowly, gradually dripping it, so to speak. I'm thinking of cloud and AI and the technology that we have. Candidly, I'm trying to learn about OpenClaw and some of these other tools that are at our disposal, and it's amazing how much people, or if you want to use a lot of these apps, you have to use these data centers, of course, and harvesting so much information. That I'm hearing about how you can have AI agents local, so it's divorced from needing an internet connection, things of that nature. And there does seem to be more and more, of a push of having it where it's all cloud, it's all streamed, of course, and it can easily be just completely usurped at the push of a button, so to speak. And it's been very easy to track. Now, you also just recently came out with an article pertaining to 6G, titled "The Coming 6G Deployment." Could you unpack that for us, and then also for those in the audience who are not aware, what is the difference between 5G and 6G?
Sure. So I would say that 5G got rolled out really to a large degree during COVID. They used that as the excuse, because remember, right at the start of it, they were trying to say that, make this distinction between essential businesses and non-essential businesses, which is, if you're in America, that's a completely unconstitutional distinction anyway. It's not like the government has the authority to decide what is essential and what isn't, because that's really the power of a massive power over businesses. They were deciding which businesses could stay open and closed based on their designations. But anyway, while they left open grocery stores and things like that, and forced other businesses to shut, they had all these telecommunications companies going around and installing 5G, the physical hardware, like the poles, the antennas, the boxes that are attached to things. And people were noticing this all around the world. And so they were pushing 5G out hard, and they were doing it right when the lockdowns were happening, so that they were minimizing disruption to their plan and pushback against it. And then there was a big correlation between the areas that had 5G first and where so-called COVID was arising. It was happening in Italy, and it was happening in other parts of the world where 5G was massively being deployed. And of course, it's no coincidence, because people were getting sick. When you introduce a whole new band of what are very unnatural frequencies to people that are more electromagnetically sensitive are going to feel that. We are energetic creatures. Humans, we rely on electricity between our nerves to communicate. We're electrical beings, and when you mess with the ambient electrical grid in the atmosphere and in the region, then that does affect us. It affects our health. It affects other things. So that was happening just 6 years ago now, 2020, during the start of the whole COVID scamdemic. Now we're in 2026, and they are pushing forward, trying to get to the next level, 6G. So to answer your question, 5G and 6G, they stand for 5th generation and 6th generation. Now, there's not an exact definition yet of what 6G is, because it's really just about the frequency ranges that they're using to then broadcast and use all their new devices on. So with 5G, there were certain bands. With 6G, they're talking about different bands like 26 gigahertz and other ranges that are less than that, maybe more like 7 gigahertz. But it's basically unlocking these new bands. But there's another aspect to it. With 6G, they want to include what they call AI native technologies, meaning that AI is built into it. So there's no way to escape it. Like, everything you do is going to be through AI. And you might have noticed that that's already started happening. When you go to a website and you hit like the contact us page for support, no matter what website it is, it seems like almost everyone now has some AI bot that you have to talk to first before you can get a real live agent, or the bot keeps just referring you to help pages and says, have you looked at this article? Have you looked at that? Now, at this stage, you can still get a human with a lot of places, but they're trying to change it so you're not going to get a human, and you have to go through AI. And then we have the whole aspect of implantables, where they want these little devices first to be on your body somehow as a wearable. Then they want to transfer that so it goes from being on your body to in your body. Klaus Schwab talked about this. Klaus Schwab, even though he's no longer the head of the World Economic Forum, he's still staying on as like a very important person behind the scenes pushing it. Now, he famously has all these speeches where he talked about the fusion of the biological, physical, and digital. And he talks about implantables. And he also talks about how they're going to introduce a world where everyone has a bot. And this robot is like your servant, but it's not just something that's going to do manual labor for you. It's going to be your source of entertainment. And it's also going to be, they want it to be an intellectual partner. So they want you to come to rely on this robot and be dependent upon it. Because of course, whoever controls AI and controls the software and controls the algorithm ultimately controls people then. Because if you then become dependent upon this robot to do certain things or to run your life, then what if that robot starts giving you slightly different answers to your questions? You probably wouldn't even realize it. It's what Google's been doing for a while with its basic search engine. You type something into Google, you expect it to be truthful, but Google has its own biases and prejudices and embed into the algorithm. And so it can change the answer slightly of what you get. And if you do that day after day, week after week, month after month, think about the huge effect that has, because your perception is being molded by something that you have no control over. You're getting slightly different answers, slightly different information, and that changes the inputs you're getting and how you think about the world and yourself. And if that happens day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you start to get a completely different idea of reality. And all the more so when you have an AI bot that's basically, if you let it, it'll start running your life and doing all these things. And then it's doing all these things in a different way with different information. It totally changes everything. That's what they want. They want this complete transformation of the society into this 2030 agenda where people are in smart cities. So we've got the implantables, we've got the AI native technologies, and we've got the opening up of these different bandwidths. And again, they're trying to push this forward, this 6G, as soon as possible. Trump put out a memorandum in December last year, 2025, talking about how the US had to win the race for 6G. And that is just more code language, because ultimately all these countries are intensely cooperating with each other. There was a paper that came out just in the last year or two talking about how the cooperation between the US and China on AI is incredibly intense and embedded. We had something like 46,000 different AI projects that they were working on jointly, the US and China. So what happens is that the leaders like to say, oh, we're in a competition against Russia or China or whatever country, and we have to make sure we win. But secretly, they're completely cooperating and they're all working towards the same outcome. And that's definitely the case with AI. All these countries are cooperating. They're all trying to do the same thing to their own populations. And we have to remember that we have more in common with the people of whatever other country is in the world, with the common people, than we do with our own leadership class, and they do with their own leadership class. And this is the same pattern that's happened throughout history. Look at World War I, when you had all these French and German soldiers fighting each other in trenches in horrific conditions and getting killed. Those French and German, whatever they were, engineers, farmers, dentists, teachers, had more in common with each other than their respective leadership class. But there they were in a ditch, in a trench, fighting each other to the death because of the ideologies that they'd been implanted with. And that's what we have to be aware of. This, now that we have a war, an Iran war, it could spread out and start involving other countries.
Absolutely, and I'll comment also that I'm not familiar with all the geopolitics surrounding Antarctica, but from what I've gathered, it is interesting how there is cooperation amongst nations, even those who are quote unquote enemies, as it relates to that continent. And so I think that's an interesting wrinkle to what you're getting at, that there is cooperation, just like you mentioned about Iran rolling out, vaccines for their people there, despite, you might think there'd be a protest, even though I guess they did their own variant of it. And then you mentioned about, obviously you used World War One as an analogy, and I think it's so fascinating that and maybe maybe non-Europeans may not fully grasp it per se, I guess, but it is interesting how you think about Europe for centuries, how these royal families, you would think like the King of England is just he has English roots, like just like to the untrained eye, and obviously it's amazing how they've got all sorts of European, even outside of Europe, DNA and the marriage and so I'll use just the UK for example. The ethnic makeup there, or Germany, or France, or Italy. How it's separate from from the people that ran the show basically. And to your point, they have more in common with another layperson, so to speak, than some other fill in the blank. So yeah, that's a really interesting, I think topic on that matter. Wanted to also touch on your article pertaining to the Noahide laws. I'm not super familiar with this. Could you touch on that?
Sure. So the Noahide laws are basically the laws of Noah. It's one of these very old set of laws that come from Judaism, and there's 7 of them, and they're actually very similar to the Ten Commandments, what became the Ten Commandments of Christianity. And if you glance at them superficially, you might think, well, what's wrong with these? These seem like reasonable commandments, and of the 7, we've got things like don't steal, don't murder, um, and we have a couple devoted to, don't take the Lord's name in vain. So basically, don't curse God, only worship God and no other gods. So they kind of seem like, okay, that they're reasonable. And the 7th law is establish world justice and world courts. So what's interesting for me is looking behind the scenes at these. Sorry, I just got a bug here.
Yeah.
Looking at these laws and seeing, well, what do they really mean? Are these actually like a good set of moral codes to which we should adhere, or is there something else going on? And I found actually there is definitely something else going on. So let me start with a few of these that you find in the Noahide laws and the Ten Commandments, which is don't take the Lord, don't curse God, and only worship God. Now I dive into this whole topic in my book, The Cult of the Chosen Ones, because on the surface that may seem like just the rule of monotheism, the rule of the Abrahamic religions. There's only one God, and don't worship idols, and don't curse this God. But let's just ask ourselves from a more philosophical standpoint. Why would a supposed supreme creator of the entire universe feel the need to start telling his or her creations to only worship him or her, and to make sure they don't worship anyone else? Like that's a very strange commandment to give to a creation. Why do we even need commandments like that? Shouldn't that be self-evident? I mean, if there's something as powerful as God that's created the entire universe, and we're just so insignificant, why do we need a commandment like that to make sure that we don't start looking elsewhere? When you really think about this, where this is coming from, isn't it much more likely that this is coming from some other kind of lower deity that may be more powerful than humans, but certainly isn't the supreme creator of the universe, and is actually some imposter? And so that's the thought I've arrived at, as well as others. And I developed this whole idea more in my book, but basically the Gnostics were an incredible people that lived around the time of Jesus, 2000 BC, and they had a whole theology that was based on the fact that according to them, this world that we live in has been hijacked, and basically there's what people in religious in Christianity would call Satan, or some people call the devil, or the big bad guy. They called the demiurge, or Yaldabaoth, and they said that he was basically an imposter that pretended he was the supreme ruler, that pretended he was God with a capital G, but he wasn't. But he was more powerful than humans. He was able to control their perception, to mentally and psychically put thoughts in their mind, and he made it seem like he was God, because he wanted to basically get people's energy. That's what worship is. When we start worshiping something, some force, we're handing over our energy and our power to that force. So that's what he wanted. He put himself in that position, and he issued these commandments. Same thing with don't curse God. It's a very strange kind of commandment or rule for an absolute supreme, being to give to what, tiny insignificant humans on a planet that's meant to be one out of trillions and trillions of planets. But it makes more sense if it's actually an imposter God that's giving that, because this imposter God wants to make sure that, he's going to get all the energy and worship and power, and no one else is going to get it. So I believe that they really need a more critical examination, these Noahide laws and the Ten Commandments. And then we get on to, there's a very strange one in the Noahide laws. It's don't eat the flesh of a living animal. Don't eat basically the flesh torn from a limb of a living animal. Again, a very strange commandment, because if you were going to come up with 7 rules for living, I don't think most people would have that in their top 7. Most people are not going to be going to an animal, ripping off a leg or an arm or some part of it and eating it. That they're going to make sure the animal is being killed first. Why is that necessary? Well, it must have been necessary because people were doing that at some point. So why were people doing that? The more questions you ask about this, it brings up a lot of really big question marks over, okay, does this somehow relate to Satanism? Is this talking about more kind of cannibalism, or is it talking about sacrifice? What's going on with this? It's very odd. And then when I look at the classic ones of like don't steal and don't murder, well, I talk a lot in my book about this cult, this Sabbatean Frankist cult that hides within Judaism and then uses ordinary Jews as shields for its satanic agenda. And the very last thing in the world is that they're going to follow these rules, because their modus operandi is to steal, is to infiltrate, is to cheat, and murder and engage in war and mass murder, genocide. So they don't follow these rules at all. In fact, they live by them. They live by stealing and murdering. It's what they get off on. So, why would we be following these rules when they're not? None of it makes sense. But where I think it really culminates, where it starts to, for me, it clicks into place of like, okay, I think I understand now what this real agenda is about with these Noahide laws. Is the 7th one: establish world courts and establish justice. So sounds good. It sounds like, okay, yeah, everyone wants freedom, peace, abundance, justice. But what is this so-called justice they're talking about? Oh, it's justice that they're going to be administering through world courts. Well, who's going to be controlling those world courts? And by what laws or jurisdiction are these rules going to be adjudicated? Well, a closer examination reveals what they want is they want it to be Talmudic, rabbinic, Jewish law. And they want to impose that on the rest of the world. And I've talked about how the Jews have at least 3 holy books: the Torah, the Talmud, and the Kabbalah. And the different sects of Judaism follow different laws. So the Sabbatean Frankists, for example, have always been very obsessed with the Kabbalah and all the numerology and the gematria in it, and using different codes within it to plan things and to basically kind of use the knowledge contained within that as like a private mystery, a secret mystery that they're not going to share with anyone else. They're going to use that to get an advantage over their fellow people. But the Talmud, it has its own whole way of looking at the world, but it's a very supremacist and racist book. I mean, if you even just take the time to just look at it for a few minutes, I mean, some of the stuff in that book is truly sick. There are passages that are talking about how it's permissible for Jews to do certain things and not non-Jews. And they're talking about raping young girls as young as 3 years old. And they're going to all this detail about under what conditions that kind of rape is permissible under Jewish rabbinic law and not permissible. I mean, the whole thing is just so sick, because to most people with common sense and good set of moral values, you don't need to analyze why pedophilia is wrong. It's wrong. It's obvious it's wrong. You don't need to analyze under what conditions it's okay to sexually abuse a child, depending on their gender and how old they are and whether they've been promised in marriage to someone, and all this nonsense. And this is what they're going into, like all the fine details of like giving themselves the permission to do this and their laws. And I'm not saying everything in the Talmud is bad, but certainly it does contain stuff like that. And they want, what they're ultimately pushing for is to, just like in Islam, how there's Sharia law, they want like Talmudic law. And when they say courts of justice, that's what they mean. They're wanting this religious law where they make up the rules, and there are like sick, twisted rules, and they want to force people to adhere to those rules. And we even had the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. He gave famous interviews where he talked about how his vision was one day that Jerusalem would be under the control of Israel. It wouldn't be, there wouldn't be any Palestinians or Arab control of it anymore, and they would establish these world courts, just like it was prophesied by one of their Jewish prophets, Isaiah. And the world courts would be held out of Jerusalem, and they would rule the entire world. So this sounds very much like, oh, this is just another way to bring in the New World Order with Israel as the headquarters. I've been talking about this for years. This is what they really want. And so what Israel's trying to do right now with this whole Greater Israel push and this Iran war, they're trying to wipe out any regional competitors. They're going to try to keep taking all the land, whether it's Palestine, they're going to keep taking Syrian land, Lebanese land, and they're going to try to neutralize Iran completely, get rid of Hezbollah, get rid of any other allies or proxies that Iran's been using, like the Houthis, Ansar Allah in Yemen, and then become the complete regional hegemon, and then completely take over Jerusalem, and then set up their world courts there, I guess first regional courts, and then make them world courts. Netanyahu, even in the last few weeks, has been boasting that through his great and wise actions, Israel is not only becoming a regional power, but even a global power. Now, you might say, okay, this guy's just like delusional, and I'm sure there's some part of it where he's just, talking up his own importance and talking up Israel's importance to his own population. But remember that this is absolutely part of their plan. They're not hiding it. The Greater Israel plan has been around for a long time, and even Israeli soldiers fighting in the IDF have an arm patch on their arm that shows the map of Greater Israel. It shows Israel controlling territory from the Nile to the Euphrates, which necessarily means taking over the land of all these countries, taking over a big part of Saudi Arabia, taking over Syria, Lebanon, going all the way up to Turkey, all the way up to Iran, taking over parts of Iraq. So they're not shy about it. They're promoting that. And a big part of that is getting control, setting up Israel as like a global power, the world center. So how do they do that? Yeah, they want, like, there's this religious sense where they want like the world courts through the prophecies that they claim that has been happening. And that's a whole nother topic that, because to me, the prophecies are basically just like, you could almost look at them as like predictive programming. They're basically just setting out their agenda and pretending, oh, look, see, some holy prophet with authority said it, when it's actually just their agenda they're trying to make happen. So there's that whole aspect of the world courts. But what is really happening, and it can't be denied, there's no religion needed to understand this, that is the cyber power that Israel is becoming, because they have invested massive amounts of money and energy into building themselves up as a cyber power, controlling software around the world, software that goes into the computers, to the devices, to everything of corporations and governments around the world. And then when Israel writes that software, they write in backdoors to that software. So then any country that ends up using that software, basically Israel has a backdoor into it, and they can start controlling. They can, at the very least, get the data and understand what's happening with these countries. But it's more than that. They can then control through backdoors, through manipulation of software. And when you control that software, then you have a massive control over the whole world. Even though Israel is just a small country with less than 10 million people and not having the geographic space and the resources and industry that other countries have, if they control the software that everyone's using, then that's how they're planning on doing it. Because the world's only becoming more and more like a cyber world where everything depends on technology. It's going more and more in that direction. So if Israel becomes the leader in cyber technologies, in AI and software, and everyone has to use that, then everyone becomes dependent upon Israel. This is really like the ulterior plan that's happening here. And unfortunately, it's very far advanced. And I spent a whole chapter in my book, a very long chapter, talking about how the 9/11 false flag operation was pulled off. And a big part of it was Israel getting control of a piece of software called Promise in the 1980s. Then that software kind of advanced and took other forms. They got that software onto all these different computers within the US, including NORAD, including the FAA, and they were able to then manipulate what the agents were seeing on their screens during September 11th, 2001. And ultimately, then they were able to pull off that entire operation, falsely blame Muslims for it, and get away with it. And if they could do that in 2001, unfortunately, the game's advanced a lot more now, and they're planning. I'm sure they're going to use this to their advantage, this ability to infiltrate and hijack computer systems of the world.
Spooky stuff. Someone mentioned me about, I think it's called Pegasus 2.0 or something, where it can clone your phone using like Wi-Fi or what have you. Like if your phone's in a certain area, it can completely clone all the contents on it. I had my friend Tony Enciso. He's got a channel, and he shared with me how, I mean, this is highly speculative, but some of these alternative, excuse me, I guess you could call them alternative. These mainstream alternative media people, names we know, that they invite their guests on, who have a message to dispense to the audience, and that there's some intelligence gathering that goes on, so to speak, when that person is visiting. I also wanted to mention, one of the things that's been interesting for me to observe is, the website that I use for my personal website is Wix. And Wix is an Israeli-based company. And Riverside, the platform we're using currently to record this, is an Israeli. It was started by an Israeli. There's some Israeli connection there with it. So it's a lot of these platforms. So it can be very easy to control it from that perspective. And I'll also add, because I know I'll have someone else or others in the audience listening, and they'll tell me, you should bring up, other forces that are controlling this group, that gets all the attention. There's another, so it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting.
Well, they have a whole unit called Unit 8200, which is part of Aman, AMAN, which is their military intelligence agency, and that's different to Mossad and Shin Bet. So there's like at least three of them. But Aman is famous for its Unit 8200 because they're like the elite of the elite as far as like spies and computer engineers go. And there are so many Unit 8200 spin-off companies. So these graduates, basically, they go into Unit 8200 for a few years, then they leave and they go and start some company, and then that company becomes really big and it ends up getting bought out by America or Europe, or even if it doesn't get bought out, it ends up developing software that then becomes really big and it gets used by all these different companies and corporations. This is happening over and over and over again. And in Israel, you never really separate yourself from the military. Even if you think you're working in some unrelated industry, it all goes back to military intelligence security, because that's the hugest industry of this country. And so it's not really like you can ever be separate from that. The government and the military intelligence community there is still making sure it has tabs on what you're doing, especially if you're like an alumni from 8200. So this is what they've built up over the course of decades. They've got the best and the brightest computer guys and spies. They've brought them into this. They're writing the software, then they're exporting it around to the world under the guise of like new startups and new companies, when it's basically like all coming from the same source. It's one thing.
Spooky stuff. What should, I guess, to as we kind of wrap things up here, I guess I'll ask you this: do you foresee boots on the ground in Iran?
Well, I don't like to kind of speculate or make predictions. I'm not a military analyst. I mean, I am following it. I can't really say the way what's going to happen with that. I can say that I just think Trump is showing himself to be an absolute idiot. He clearly didn't plan for this. He doesn't know what's happening one moment to the next. He's just spouting off whatever comes into his brain. There is no real. He's got no real plan. Hegseth's got no real plan. So whatever planning there may be, it's not coming from them. It's coming from this satanic cult that controls the U.S. and Israel and is telling them what to do. And they'll find ways to push that agenda forward if they can. If they decide that the best way to prolong this war and achieve their goals of energy rationing or lockdowns or depopulation is to keep this war going longer, and in order to do that, if they need to send American troops in to die, then they'll do that, unfortunately. Even though this was hugely unpopular, right from the start, it seemed like only 20 to 25% of people supported it. I saw a recent poll in the last few days that there are now 66% of people saying it should be ended right now, even if there's no resolution, or even if America can't declare victory, just end it now. 66% of people are saying that. So this is hugely unpopular. Even though we've got those kind of numbers on happening and the general feeling of the US population, unfortunately, there's just still so much apathy, and there's no real strong anti-war movement that they will be able to get away with sending ground troops in if that's what the agenda dictates.
Yeah, absolutely. I lean more towards them putting boots on the ground, and I was actually just I have poly markets pulled up, and that's been an interesting thing to check out. Given where people are putting their money, judging by what I'm looking at, it does look like they don't see this conflict wrapping up by any stretch, and that it will presumably last for some time. Um, it's yeah, pretty fascinating. Makia, is there anything else that you'd like to dispense before we wrap up? And then also, how can people learn more about you and get in touch?
Well, yeah, there's one thing I wanted to add. You asked me earlier about 6G. So I did want to add that there is a new kind of wafer thin, very, very small brain chip that they're already in development on different countries. China's doing it. China's doing brain implants, but it's called BISC, BISC, and it stands for biological interface system to cortex, which is just a fancy way of saying connecting the internet, anything with AI, smart grid, to your brain, to your biology. So this is part of 6G as well, this biological interface system to cortex, BISC. Look for this to be sold to the public. They're going to try and do a soft sell at first and tell you how amazing it is. Then they're going to start to do a hard sell and say, well, you have to get this in order to fill in the gap, get like an essential service, engage in banking, whatever. So this is just around the corner. It's coming up very, very soon with 6G. People really have to get aware of this agenda and see what we can do to build decentralized systems and basically do what we can to be independent as possible in the onslaught and the coming advancement of all of this. So for me, my main website is thefreedomarticles.com. That is the best place to get all of my work, to get my books. I'm also on several platforms such as Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Brightly on Substack, YouTube. And you can subscribe to any of those. You can subscribe via my website to get updates. I put out videos frequently commenting on, offering analysis and commentary on what's really happening in the world behind the scenes.
And I encourage people to check out Makia's latest book, The Cult of the Chosen Ones, which has been banned on a number of platforms. So I encourage people to check out that book. It's a great read or audiobook. And yeah, I guess the main message takeaway is just be prepared as best you can. I do sense that something big is in the works and is coming, because I've had some people completely go cash, like they're out of the market completely, and I'm leaning towards that too, just kind of getting out completely. So we'll no doubt be in touch. Be well, and thanks for making the time today, Makia.
Thanks for having me on again, Christian.
Appreciate you tuning in and watching. If you enjoyed it, if you enjoyed the video, you found value, and I encourage you to like, share, subscribe, /follow. The show is on YouTube and Spotify. Always look forward to your feedback, and appreciate you tuning in. Be well and take care.